So I don't think this is news to anyone in this room, given who we are, but as a researcher, I am not a big fan of binaries. And that's because people's behaviors, their beliefs, their experiences, they are a lot richer than what we can possibly just distill down into a couple of tiny little boxes. And yet, when we are faced with something that is complex or uncertain, often that is our natural just instinct as humans, is to take that thing and to boil it down into a simpler narrative that is easier for us to stomach. And the narrative that was at the forefront of my mind when I was coming up with this talk, for whatever reason, I was haunted by my 10th grade English class, specifically Hamlet. Now, if you have not had to suffer through that, or if it's been a minute, I'll give you the gist right now. Okay, so the protagonist, Hamlet, spends most of the play just absolutely paralyzed by a single choice: to be or not to be. To either live and endure relentless injustice and suffering, or choose death as a peaceful end to all of that. Apparently, he only had two options, nothing in between. And I think when it comes to AI, we are making the same mistake as Hamlet. Okay, we are taking something that is uncertain, it is complex, it is messy, and we are oversimplifying it in the ways that we talk about it with one another. And as a result, we are not getting nearly the amount of value that we could out of this technology. And so, over the next 20 or so minutes that I have with you, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to talk about why our research practices are not getting the productivity benefits that motivated so many of us to incorporate this tech into our workflows in the first place. I'm going to go through 4 tensions that your researchers are navigating as they themselves are trying to adapt to this new future in working. And I'm going to make the case that as reops professionals, the tooling that we procure, the training that we provide, and the norms that we establish are ultimately what will dictate whether or not researchers on your team can use AI deliberately, or if they're just going to take the path of least resistance. But before I get into that, let's talk a little bit about how do we get here, because a lot has changed. Audience engagement, what percentage of American adults do you think use generative AI? 89. Come on, somebody else. 62? I feel like I'm at an auction. I'm like, can I get another one? Can I get another one? All right, so spoiler, some of you were closer than others. The answer is slightly more than half. So within 3 years of becoming mainstream for ChatGPT, over half of American adults, and this is outside of tech, this is Gen Pop, use generative AI. To understand what a big deal this is, I want to talk about 2 other technologies that have fundamentally changed how we get work done. So if we look at the PC from IBM, 3 years after IBM launched the PC in 1981, we saw adoption sitting at about 20%. And when we look at the internet, in 1995, 3 years after the internet opened up to commercial traffic, we saw adoption sitting at 30%. And as a reminder, 3 years after Gen AI became mass available to the public, we were sitting at 55%. And that means that generative AI is the most rapidly adopted general purpose technology in history, okay? But adoption doesn't necessarily mean impact. So 70% of companies that report having integrated AI into their process, 89% of those firms report that they have not experienced productivity gains. And on the surface, this feels like a pretty damning statistic, but it's not, okay? This is actually entirely to be expected and something that we've seen happen before. We've been here before. So on the slide, on the right-hand side, is what you see called the J-curve of change. And what that pattern describes is when you have the rapid adoption of a new technology, in the short term, you can actually see productivity or performance decline before it ultimately recovers and eventually surpasses where you started. And the reason that is because getting access to a technology is not the same thing or challenge as learning how to use it effectively. And so if you, like me, have been sitting around on LinkedIn, reading thought leadership pieces and being like, I'm not seeing this transformative difference. If anything, like some things for me are feeling clunkier or slower. Most people feel that way, and you're not doing anything wrong. Your practices aren't doing anything wrong. It just means that right now, you're in the dip. So how do we get out of it? How do we get out of this dip of destruction, okay? If you have gone looking for any guidance on that topic, you have probably seen some headlines that look a little bit like this. Unfortunately, online discourse very heavy in hot takes, a little light on nuance, okay? And so for me, what I've really noticed is that these conversations are extremely polarized, right? Like, we're not just talking about technology, we're talking about our values, our livelihoods, our futures, and so people are impassioned. But when we have these polarized binaries, it just pushes people to either side of the spectrum, and we end up speaking past one another. And when I look at the few individuals or practices that are getting the most out of AI, they have one thing in common, and that's that they realize that both sides of this debate are onto something. They both make valid points. And when you have two things that on the surface look like they should be contradictions, but they actually both can be true at the same time, that's what's known as a tension. And again, our brains are very uncomfortable with these things, and we try to resolve that discomfort by just picking a side. And that's often what we do when we have these conversations about AI, is we pick the side that feels most comfortable to us or that we agree with. And that is why we're stuck in the pit, because when we resolve tensions that way, we're not resolving them. We're just stopping seeing half of the argument, and as a result, we end up with a massive blind spot. But everyone in this room is better than that, okay? We can know better, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna look at the full picture instead and sit in that messy middle and discomfort. And so over the next couple of slides, I'm gonna go through the 4 tensions that your researchers are trying to figure out how to navigate so that they can use this technology effectively. All right. So the first tension is that AI can dramatically accelerate individual output, and it can create more work for the folks around you. And when you have AI set on something that was within its capabilities, it is not an overstatement to say that it feels a little bit like having a superpower or like magic. The problem is that with AI's capabilities, they're not always what you'd expect, okay? And so if we were to map them, like we have on this slide, what AI is good at, it wouldn't be this nice, predictable curve. It would have this series of peaks and valleys. And this is what research calls the jagged technological frontier. So something that you think is really complex, like it's not always intuitive what's outside of the frontier. Something that's super complex can be where AI kills it. And then something that feels really simple, or something you've even done before and gotten good results from, can be where it falls apart completely. The scary thing, or the challenge, is that when AI is operating outside of its frontier, it's not going to put up its hand and say, hey, Allison, I really don't think I can do that. It is going to give you an answer, and that answer is typically going to be something that's really polished, and like even at first glance, like maybe even coherent. And so that is how we end up burying folks in AI slop. So 40% of American workers within the past month have reported receiving output that, has polish but no substance. And I expect that that number is actually underreported. The second tension is that AI can make us better at our jobs, and it can trick us into thinking we're a little more capable than we are. And when used well as an expert collaborator, AI can help you tackle problems that are maybe like just outside of your reach. It can help you skill up, and it can clear obstacles out of your way. The challenge is that prompting a great answer and understanding that answer are not the same thing, and it's really easy to conflate the two. Now, something that was a real surprise to me when I put together this talk was that this tendency isn't just something that AI newbies experience. It's actually a tendency that is more predominant with folks that are extremely comfortable with this technology. And that is because the better you can prompt, the more polished your outputs are going to be, and it's easy to conflate those two. And that's made further more complicated by the fact that AI tends to gas you up. It agrees with you, might even be a little bit of a sycophant unless you're pushing up against it. And that can make it even more difficult to notice the gap in your understanding versus what your output is. The third tension is that AI can act as a scaffold that helps you think, and it can also chip away at your ability to think without it. So at its best, AI is this non-judgmental partner. Like, it is never going to be upset to see you darken its doorstep. It's never going to get annoyed at you when you're like, hey, can you explain that to me for the 5th time? But this time, like, I'm 5. And so it really is this wonderful thought partner when used effectively. So you can think out loud, you can be wrong, you can change your mind, you can pick up a thread, a couple hours after you put it down. And that's because, unlike a lot of tools, AI doesn't just capture your thinking, it lets you engage with it. So you can stress test your assumptions, you can steelman a perspective, you can take a really underbaked idea and riff on that until it forms something more concrete. And so the problem or the danger isn't using AI to help you think, it is when you outsource that cognitive activity entirely. And when you do that, it shows up in your brain. So researchers have found that individuals that offload thinking to AI in its entirety show weaker recall and also decreased neural activity in the areas of the brain that are responsible for critical reasoning. And our brain is like any muscle. You need to exercise it or else it's going to atrophy. And then the final tension that I think that we don't talk about often enough is that AI can help us produce objectively good work and still trigger a social penalty. Now, in an ideal world, if we're producing good work, really shouldn't matter the tools that we're using to get there. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So we're not talking about AI slop here. We're talking about high quality outputs. So when people learn that AI was involved in a process, they tend to overcredit the contribution that the tool made and undervalue the human. And worse still, if you were to hold the quality bar constant, individuals that use AI are seen as less competent, independent, and ambitious than colleagues that produce the same quality of work without it, which leads to really silly things like spending a half an hour removing the rule of 3 and M dashes from your writing. We're trying to make it clear, we didn't use the technology that we've all received a mandate to use. And it's like, who are we fooling? And so this is something I think that we don't talk a lot about, is we often are caught between a rock and a hard place here with how we're using AI. So the reason that I go through these tensions is because these are the challenges that your researchers are still working through on the daily. And knowing that these tensions exist is a prerequisite to using AI deliberately. But this still leaves us with a very practical question of okay, so how do you navigate these things? How do you capture the benefits of this tech while avoiding the pitfalls? And if you ask that in any room, you're probably going to hear a similar answer, which is just keep a human in the loop. Great advice, but what does that even mean? So this advice doesn't say anything about when said human should show up or what they should do when they get there. And when we try to fill in those blanks for ourselves, we're often picturing something pretty similar. We're going to give AI a task. It's going to produce an output, and we're going to review that output. And what we're describing here is automation. And for a lot of tasks, that's a perfectly reasonable way to work. But the issue that I see with a lot of frameworks is that they conflate automation with AI maturity. So the theory is that the more you automate, the more advanced you are, the more progress you've made. And this kind of thinking just doesn't come out of left field or nowhere. We are actually culturally conditioned to associate automation with progress. So if you think of any pop culture reference, so whether that's the Jetsons or Star Trek or insert nerdy show here, they all depict a very similar version of the future where machines take on more of our work so we can either kick up our feet and relax or pursue the things that matter. And so we've become very comfortable with this idea of technology taking on more aspects of the work that we'd rather not do. And sooner or later, this idea of removing human judgment from a process stops feeling controversial and in some cases might even feel a bit like an upgrade. And that is techno-chauvinism in a nutshell. Or the belief that technological solutions are inherently superior to human ones. And because that belief has been unconsciously baked into our collective psyches for so long, automation feels like a natural measure of progress. But If automation is your measure of AI maturity for your research practice, it is also going to be your ceiling. And that is because automation can only get you so far. So some tasks are best automated. Like, it is very true that automation in the context of research helps us move faster, it lets us cover more ground, and it frees up our researchers to do higher value added tasks. But sometimes you need a human that is more firmly in the driver's seat. And so automation and augmentation are both ways of working with AI, but there are some very important differences in how that shows up, or how we show up. So the first is in what's driving the work. So AI, in the case of automation, is going to follow programmed objectives, okay? We give it an input, it executes against that input. And an input is not the same thing as a goal. AI, in this case, it's not trying to do anything. It's following instructions. When we look at augmentation, where we have humans more thoroughly woven in throughout that process, what we are bringing to the table is a conscious intention, because we as human beings have a purpose that goes beyond just following instructions. We understand the point behind what we're trying to do, and unlike AI, we maintain that conscious intention. And we are the ones that are determining ultimately what those rules are in service of. So in terms of how we show up, with automation, our role is much more that of a supervisor, right? So we're setting the rules, we're providing context, we're giving it a task, and then we're making sure that AI handled that task according to those things. With augmentation, we're much more like a navigator. So we're more fluidly embedded throughout the process, and we are constantly redirecting AI back towards our intention. And then finally, what defines success? So with automation, we're going to be primarily concerned with accuracy. And that is because we have pre-established criteria that we can map against to be like, did it do the thing that I wanted it to do? With augmentation, we've got something that feels a little esoteric, but it really comes down to just this idea of conceptual integrity. So did the output faithfully represent what you intended for? And what we see here then is that there is more than one way to work with AI. And in fact, there are three. So what I'm going to show you comes out of a study that was published by the Harvard Business School, where they took a boatload of consultants, they gave them a task, and then they looked at the different ways that they used AI. And they identified 3 ways of being in the loop. So the first is the self-automator. This is a form of automation. And in this way of being in the loop, we are largely taking a problem, we're handing it over, and largely accepting what AI comes back with very little modification. And this is a perfectly reasonable way to work when the context calls for it, right? Like if it's a routine, low stakes, or even like time-constrained task, self-automator is probably your go-to for being in the loop in those circumstances. The second is the centaur. So this is a form of augmentation, and like the name suggests, we've got like a clear delineation of the tasks that you are remaining firmly in the driver's seat for versus what you're handing off to the AI. And then finally, we have the cyborg. This is also a form of augmentation, but instead of having those clearly delineated things that we are keeping back versus what we are giving over to AI, this is a lot more like you're riffing, okay? So you're going back and forth, you're feeding it new context, you're challenging it, you're asking it to explain itself. And so this feels a lot more conversational in nature. Now, these are not BuzzFeed personality quizzes, okay? We don't just have like one, like we have a star sign. That is not how this works. So we will very likely have one way of being in the loop that comes maybe a little bit more naturally to us, but we have to resist that urge to go onto autopilot. And ideally, you should be equally comfortable moving between these modes of in the loop, depending on the circumstances that you're in. Because if we go into autopilot, that's where we again start to get into trouble. And that is a form of cognitive surrender. And Ethan Mollick is one of the contributors to the study that I mentioned that identified those 3 ways of being in the loop. And Ethan argues that the point isn't to avoid AI, but to be intentional about it by making a conscious choice about AI use rather than reflexive dependence or reflexive avoidance. And so the key point here is that we need to be deliberate. We need to make this choice intentionally. But individual intentionality can only get you so far, right? Your researchers on your team are not going to be able to make deliberate choices if the training, the tooling, and the norms that are established for them only support or reward one way of being in the loop. And so my thesis is that a research practice that demonstrates high levels of AI maturity is one that builds the conditions for its researchers to make that choice deliberately and then to move fluidly between automation and augmentation as the tasks in front of them call for. And establishing those conditions requires three things. This is where you all come in, research ops folks. So the first is tooling. So if your technology stack only supports automation and doesn't give, for example, a conversational interface for your researchers to go back and forth or engage with AI, you are limiting how they can be in the loop. You're precluding that choice from them. The second is training. We have spent a ton of time in recent years upskilling researchers on how to be better at prompting, which is important, but on its own, it's not sufficient. We need to be developing training that helps people familiarize themselves with the different ways of being in the loop, and then develops the judgment that they can then exercise to choose when to move between those modes. And then finally, and most importantly, norms. Okay, what happens here is if speed and output are the only thing that your researchers are getting rewarded for, they are going to default to automation every single time because that is the incentive that they have. And so we need to make sure that we have this shared organizational norm that to do good research means to be deliberate about how we stay in the loop. That is a prerequisite to doing good research, because otherwise you can procure the tools, you can run the training, none of it is going to stick unless the culture supports this way of working. And so I'm sure you're doing a time check at this point and you're like, you are running out of time, Allison. How do we do these things effectively? This seems complicated and messy. Surely there is a shortcut. There is not. Which brings us back to where we started, right? When something feels complex or uncertain or scary, oftentimes our immediate reaction is to pick a side, to simplify it, to try to find that easy answer. But as we've seen over the course of this talk, that is what keeps getting us into trouble. It is what is keeping us in the pit. Whether it is the really polarized discussions about do we use AI or don't we in the first place, really narrow definitions about what it means to be a human in the loop, or conflating automation with AI maturity. Which also brings us back to our pal Hamlet. I have not forgotten him. Hamlet was trapped in a binary of his own making. He created that for himself, and that binary ultimately became his cage. But we are not Hamlet. We know better, and we can recognize the cage for what it is, and we can choose then to step outside it and to exist in that messy middle and to build something better, which I know everyone in this room is up for that challenge. So that's where I'll leave you. Thank you so much.